Every year, in certain regions of the world, records show that thousands of babies were born. On the surface, this seems like a straightforward historical fact. Births were recorded, numbers were logged, officials noted the arrivals, and for anyone reading through those documents casually, there would appear to be nothing unusual about them. A society was functioning. Children were being born. Life was continuing in the way it always had. But when researchers began looking beyond those initial records, when they started asking what came next, what happened to those children after their births were noted, something unexpected appeared. The numbers didn't follow the pattern one would expect. And that unexpected pattern is what makes this particular case worth examining very carefully. The figure most consistently referenced across the available historical sources is approximately 15,000 births per year. That number appears in regional records, in administrative logs, and in documents that were created not for any investigative purpose, but simply to track the ordinary movements of a population. It was a number recorded by people who had no reason to falsify it or exaggerate it. It was simply the count. 15,000 children entering the world each year, in these particular regions, under these particular circumstances. For a long time, that figure sat quietly in the records. It was referenced occasionally, noted in passing, and generally treated as background information rather than as a subject worthy of deeper examination. But the figure itself was never seriously disputed. It was simply there, documented and consistent, year after year. What researchers eventually began to notice was not the number of births, but what followed. When they tried to trace the lives of those 15,000 children beyond the moment of their recorded arrival, the trail became remarkably difficult to follow. And when they were able to piece together enough information to form a picture, that picture was deeply troubling. Roughly 90% of those children did not survive past their earliest months of life. That is not a rough estimate or an exaggeration. It is the conclusion drawn from a careful comparison of birth records against mortality data, burial records, and other sources that track what happened to individuals after they entered the record. 9 out of every 10. That is the scale of what the documents, when read together, appear to show. Now, the first response to a figure like that is usually to reach for the most obvious explanation. High infant mortality was a defining feature of life in many historical periods. Before modern medicine, before antibiotics, before any real understanding of how infection spreads, children died at rates that are almost unimaginable by today's standards. Even in relatively stable communities with adequate food and shelter, losing a significant portion of children in their first year was not exceptional. It was, in many regions and many eras, simply the reality of life. So when someone first encounters the 90% figure, the natural instinct is to place it within that broader historical context and move on. And for a long time, that is exactly what happened. But this is where it becomes unclear. Because the standard explanation for high historical infant mortality, limited medicine, widespread disease, poor nutrition, only holds if the circumstances match those conditions. And when researchers began looking more carefully at the specific context surrounding these 15,000 annual births, they found that the match was not as clean as the official explanation suggested. Some of the expected conditions were present, others were not. And in certain cases, the conditions that should have been driving the mortality rate simply did not appear to account for the scale of the losses. That gap between what the explanation predicted and what the evidence showed is where the first serious questions began to form. What made the pattern particularly difficult to dismiss was its specificity. High infant mortality in history tends to be broadly distributed. It affects communities across different regions, different social groups, different environments. It rises when disease strikes, falls when conditions improve, and generally responds to the factors that we know influence survival in early life. But the losses connected to these 15,000 annual births did not behave that way. They concentrated in particular places. They appeared under particular conditions. They followed a shape that was more structured and more consistent than random historical tragedy tends to produce. And that structure is what separates this case from a simple record of historical hardship. The locations where the losses were most concentrated are a significant part of this pattern. When the geographic distribution of the deaths is mapped against the broader landscape of mortality in the same regions and the same periods, something stands out. The losses were not evenly spread across the communities where these births were occurring. They were heavier in some locations than others. And the factors that determined which locations saw the highest mortality were not always the factors one would expect. Proximity to disease outbreaks, access to food, environmental conditions. These variables existed, and they mattered, but they don't fully explain why certain specific locations recorded losses that were dramatically higher than others operating under what appeared to be comparable conditions. The timing is also worth examining. Periods of particularly high mortality within this broader pattern did not always align with the events that typically drove death rates upward in the historical record. When disease swept through a region, one expects to see mortality rise. When harvests failed and food became scarce, one expects the numbers to worsen. And sometimes they did. But there were also periods where the concentration of losses seemed to occur in the absence of those obvious external triggers. The deaths clustered in ways that the standard causal framework struggles to account for. At first, it seems like a straightforward case of historical hardship. But there is a problem. The hardship doesn't fully align with the pattern the evidence leaves behind. There's also the question of documentation. Historical mortality, even in periods with limited record-keeping, tends to leave traces. Death records, burial registers, parish logs, official reports, these exist in varying degrees of completeness, but they generally exist. Researchers working with historical populations can usually find some form of evidence that a death occurred, even if the records are sparse or imprecise. But when they followed the trail of these particular 15,000 annual births, they found that the expected documentation was often absent. Not just incomplete. Absent. A birth would be recorded, and then the record would simply stop. No follow-up. No notation of what happened next. The child appeared in the historical record once, at the moment of their arrival, and then disappeared from it entirely. This raises questions that the standard explanation doesn't fully address. If the children were dying from disease, from malnutrition, from the common causes of historical infant mortality, why weren't those deaths being recorded with the same consistency as the births? The systems that logged the arrivals were functioning. They were producing numbers. They were creating documents that have survived to the present day, and that researchers have been able to examine. If the deaths was simply the expected outcome of historical conditions, why did the documentation of those deaths not match the documentation of the births that preceded them? The absence of records is not neutral. It is itself a piece of evidence, and it is evidence that doesn't fit comfortably into the simple version of events. Some researchers have pointed to administrative disorganization as the explanation for missing records. Record-keeping in historical institutional settings was often inconsistent, they argue. Clocks were overburdened. Systems were poorly maintained. It is not surprising that follow-up documentation would be incomplete. This is a reasonable point, and it applies to many historical cases. But in this particular situation, there is a difficulty with that argument. The birth records were being maintained with notable consistency. 15,000 entries per year, documented across multiple regions, over an extended period of time. That level of documentation requires a functioning administrative system. It is difficult to explain how that same system was simultaneously capable of recording thousands of births with regularity, and yet incapable of producing any meaningful record of what happened to those children afterward. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because what the evidence suggests, not conclusively, but suggestively, is that the absence of follow-up documentation was not simply the result of administrative failure. Something else may have been shaping what was recorded and what was not. Why certain information was preserved carefully while other information seems to have been lost or never created in the first place. This is not a claim. It is an observation, but it is an observation that doesn't fully make sense within the standard framework, and that is precisely why it deserves to be held up and examined rather than set aside. What is perhaps most significant is not any single element of this pattern, but the combination, the scale of the losses, the geographic and temporal concentration, the mismatch between the mortality rate and the external conditions that are usually used to explain historical infant death, the gap between birth records and the documentation of what followed. Each of these points, taken individually, might be explained away with one argument or another. Researchers have tried, and some of those arguments have partial merit. But when all of these elements are considered together, as parts of a single pattern, the explanations begin to feel less complete. They account for some of what the evidence shows, but not all of it. And the parts they don't account for are not small details. They are central to understanding what this pattern actually represents. The researchers who have spent significant time with these records tend to reach a similar point in their investigation. They begin with the standard explanations. They follow the evidence as it exists in the documents. and they arrive at a place where the evidence and the explanation no longer align cleanly. Not because the explanation is necessarily wrong in all of its elements, but because it is incomplete in ways that matter. The 90% figure is not simply a number that confirms what we already know about historical infant mortality. It is a number that raises questions those explanations haven't yet answered. And those unanswered questions are what give this case its particular quality. The sense that something in the historical record is not fully visible, that there is a layer to this story that the available documentation doesn't quite reveal. What exactly that hidden layer might be, whether it reflects a structural failure, a form of institutional indifference, something more deliberate, or simply the limitations of historical record-keeping pushed to an extreme, is not something the current evidence resolves. Different researchers have approached the same material and arrived at different interpretations. Some are more willing to extend the benefit of the doubt to the standard explanations. Others believe the pattern is too consistent and too specific to be fully accounted for by the usual historical factors. The debate has not produced a consensus, and it is unlikely to produce one quickly. The records that might settle the question are either absent or ambiguous, and that ambiguity is part of what makes this case so persistent as a subject of investigation. What remains, after all the examination, is a question that sits at the center of the historical record without a clear answer surrounding it. 15,000 children born each year. A 90% mortality rate that concentrates in specific places at specific times in ways that don't fully match the available explanations. Documentation that begins clearly and then falls silent. And a pattern that has repeated itself consistently enough that it cannot simply be attributed to chance or circumstance. The question of why so many disappeared is still open. The question of why the explanation remains so unclear is, in some ways, even more difficult to answer, because it suggests that the uncertainty is not simply the result of lost records or historical distance. It suggests that the explanation, whatever it is, has not yet been fully found, or perhaps fully sought. When researchers and historians first encountered the mortality figures connected to these 15,000 annual births, most of them turned to the same set of explanations. These were not unreasonable explanations. They were grounded in well-established historical and medical knowledge. They drew from decades of scholarship about pre-modern life, about the conditions that shaped survival in earlier centuries, and about the limitations that defined medical practice long before the modern era. On the surface, the framework seemed to fit, and for a significant period of time, it was accepted as sufficient. Understanding why that framework was so readily adopted, and why it held for so long without serious challenge, is an important part of examining this case clearly. The first and most frequently cited explanation is poor sanitation. In many historical environments, sanitation systems as we understand them today simply did not exist. Waste management was inadequate. Water sources were often contaminated. The physical spaces where people lived, worked, and cared for children were frequently exposed to conditions that, by modern standards, would be considered deeply unsafe. For newborns, who have no developed immune system and no ability to protect themselves from environmental hazards, these conditions were genuinely dangerous. The connection between poor sanitation and infant death is well documented across many historical periods and many different geographic contexts. It is one of the most reliable explanations historians reach for when examining high mortality rates in early life. So when this explanation was applied to the 15,000 births and the losses that followed, it felt like a natural and defensible fit. Alongside sanitation, scholars pointed to the absence of medical knowledge. The understanding of disease, infection, and the specific vulnerabilities of newborns developed very gradually over centuries. For most of the periods being examined here, there was no concept of germ theory. There was no understanding of how bacteria or viruses spread. Treatments that are now considered basic, cleaning wounds, managing fever, providing hydration, were either unknown or applied inconsistently. Midwives and caregivers worked with the knowledge they had, which was often limited and sometimes actively harmful. In this context, a high death rate among newborns was not surprising. It was the predictable outcome of caring for extremely vulnerable human beings without the tools or knowledge needed to protect them effectively. This explanation, too, seemed reasonable when applied to the case at hand. Malnutrition was identified as another contributing factor. Mothers who were malnourished during pregnancy were more likely to deliver children who were already weakened at birth. Low birth weight, underdeveloped immune function, and reduced capacity to feed successfully were all outcomes associated with maternal malnutrition. In regions and periods where food supply was uncertain, where poverty was widespread, and where the nutritional needs of pregnant women were poorly understood, these risks were elevated. A malnourished child entering a contaminated environment without medical support faced extraordinarily poor odds of survival. The combination of these factors, stacked together, produced a picture that historians found convincing. The 90% mortality rate, in this reading, was simply the logical result of multiple overlapping disadvantages. Disease was perhaps the most prominent element of the official explanation. Infectious illness was the leading cause of death across all age groups in pre-modern populations, and newborns were among the most susceptible. Respiratory infections could overwhelm an underdeveloped immune system within days. Waterborne diseases, transmitted through contaminated feeding or through contact with unsanitary surfaces, were often fatal for infants. Fever, which could result from any number of infections, was particularly dangerous in the earliest weeks of life, when the body had no developed capacity to regulate temperature or fight illness. Historians have documented epidemic events across many regions where infant mortality spiked dramatically in a short period, only to return to its already high baseline once the outbreak passed. Disease, in this framework, was not just a contributing factor. It was understood as the central engine of infant death in pre-modern settings. The framework, when presented in its complete form, carried considerable institutional weight. It was not the conclusion of a single researcher or a single study. It was the consensus position held by medical historians, demographers, and scholars who had spent careers studying pre-modern populations. Their collective judgment was that extreme infant mortality was a defining characteristic of life before modern medicine, and that any specific case of high early childhood death could be understood within that broader pattern. The 90% figure associated with these 15,000 births was, in their view, alarming to modern eyes but not historically unusual. It was placed on a spectrum alongside other documented cases of extreme infant mortality, and it was judged to belong there. That institutional consensus carried significant authority. It discouraged further questioning. It suggested that the case was, in its essential features, already understood. And for a long time, that consensus held. Researchers who encountered the records accepted the framework. Those who wrote about the case positioned it within the established historical narrative of pre-modern childhood mortality. The 90% figure was noted, sometimes with expressions of sadness or reflection on the hardships of earlier eras, but it was not treated as a puzzle requiring further investigation. The explanation was considered complete. The case was considered closed, and the records, with all of their gaps and inconsistencies, sat undisturbed in archives while the official version of events went largely unchallenged. But this is where it becomes unclear, because accepting an explanation requires that the explanation actually fits the evidence. And the more carefully some researchers began to examine the specific details of this case, not the general framework of historical infant mortality, but the particular circumstances surrounding these births, these losses, and these records, the more they began to notice things that didn't quite align. Small discrepancies at first, details that were slightly off, patterns that the framework predicted but didn't actually appear in the data, alongside other patterns that the framework didn't predict but that appeared clearly in the record. These were not dramatic contradictions. They were quiet ones. But quiet contradictions, accumulated over time, have a way of becoming significant. One of the first things that some researchers noticed was the quality of the birth records themselves. The documentation of these 15,000 annual births was, by historical standards, notably consistent. This was not a case of scattered, incomplete, or poorly maintained records. The births were being tracked with a degree of regularity and detail that suggested a functioning administrative system. Names, dates, locations, these elements appeared with enough consistency to allow researchers to compile reliable totals. And this is where a question begins to form. If the system was capable of producing consistent, detailed birth records, why did that same system fail so completely to document what happened next? The capability was clearly there. The records that followed the births, or rather the absence of those records, suggests that the capability existed but was not being applied. At first, it seems like a simple matter of administrative limitation. Record-keeping was inconsistent in many historical settings. Not every death was logged. Not every burial was registered. This is a known feature of pre-modern documentation, and it is a reasonable point. But there's a problem with applying it straightforwardly to this particular case. The inconsistency was not evenly distributed. The births were recorded carefully. The deaths were not. That asymmetry, detailed records at one end of the children's lives and near-complete silence at the other, is difficult to explain as simple administrative limitation. It suggests something more selective was happening. And selectivity in record-keeping is a different kind of problem than general administrative inadequacy. Some researchers began asking not just what caused the deaths, but why the records of those deaths were so incomplete. This was a different kind of question. It shifted the focus from the mortality itself to the documentation surrounding it. And once that shift happened, a new set of observations became relevant. In comparable historical settings, institutions with similar populations, similar administrative structures, similar periods, mortality records tended to exist in some form, even when they were imprecise. The complete absence of follow-up documentation for such a large number of children was not the historical norm. It was an exception, and exceptions in historical research are worth examining carefully rather than absorbing into the general explanation. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because if the deaths were simply the expected outcome of the era, tragic but unremarkable, predictable given the conditions, then there was no particular reason to avoid documenting them. Deaths were recorded in historical settings all the time, including deaths of infants, including deaths in institutional environments with poor conditions. The act of recording a death did not require modern medicine or advanced administrative systems. It required only that someone note what had happened. The fact that this notation is largely absent from the record surrounding these 15,000 births is not easily explained by the same framework that explains the deaths themselves. The framework addresses why children died. It does not address why the evidence of those deaths is so consistently missing. This question, about the records rather than the mortality, is what began to open the investigation beyond its original boundaries. Researchers who had accepted the standard explanation found themselves returning to the archives with a different kind of attention. They were no longer simply confirming what the framework predicted. They were looking at the space between what the records showed and what the record should have shown, and they were asking why that space existed. The answers they found were not simple. They did not point cleanly in one direction, but they consistently suggested that the standard explanation, while not entirely wrong, was not complete enough to account for all of the evidence. What the official account offered was a description of general historical conditions. It described the environment in which these deaths occurred. It identified the forces, disease, malnutrition, inadequate medicine, that were present and capable of causing the losses. But it did not explain why this particular case, with its particular scale and its particular pattern of documentation, looked the way it did. The general conditions of pre-modern life were widespread. They affected many populations in many regions, but not all of those populations left behind records with the same specific shape as the ones connected to these 15,000 annual births. Something about this case was different, and the standard explanation, applied at its usual level of generality, was not equipped to identify what that difference was. The researchers who first began to notice these gaps were not, in most cases, approaching the material with a predetermined conclusion. They were not looking for scandal or mystery. They were doing the ordinary work of historical investigation, reading documents, comparing sources, checking figures against each other. It was through that ordinary work that the questions appeared. And once the questions appeared, they proved difficult to set aside. Because they were not speculative questions built on assumption. They were questions grounded in what the records actually showed, and, just as importantly, in what the records conspicuously failed to show. The official explanation had described the deaths as the expected outcome of the era, but it had not explained why the era, in this particular case, had produced such an unusual record of silence around those deaths. That silence was not part of the expected outcome, and it was the silence, more than anything else, that suggested the investigation was not yet finished. This is where the first real problem appears. Not in the mortality rate itself, not in the general conditions that surrounded these births. The problem appears in the records, or more precisely, it appears in what the records are missing. Because when researchers began looking beyond the birth documentation, when they moved past the initial entries and searched for what came next, they found something that is difficult to explain using the standard framework. The trail went cold. Not gradually, not partially, but in many cases almost completely. A child was born, the birth was noted, and then the record simply stopped. No follow-up, No continuation. Just silence where documentation should have been. To understand why that silence is significant, it helps to understand what historical records typically look like when large numbers of children die. Death, even in pre-modern settings, was not an undocumented event. It was a social and administrative reality that institutions and communities made some effort to record. Parish registers logged burials. Local authorities noted deaths in their jurisdictions. Facilities that cared for individuals, whether those individuals were adults or children, generally produced some form of record when those individuals died. The records were not always precise. They were not always complete. But they existed. They left traces. And those traces are what allow historians to reconstruct mortality patterns across many different periods and many different populations with a reasonable degree of confidence. That is what makes the silence surrounding these 15,000 annual births so unusual. It is not that the records are imprecise or incomplete in the way that historical records normally are. It is that in many cases, they are simply absent. The expected traces are not there. Researchers going through regional archives have noted this repeatedly. They find the birth entries. They search for what follows. And they find very little, sometimes nothing at all. For individual cases, an absence of follow-up documentation might not draw much attention. Records get lost. Documents deteriorate. Single entries disappear from archives for many ordinary reasons. But when the absence is this widespread, this consistent, and this specifically concentrated around one particular group of children, the ordinary explanations begin to feel insufficient. It is worth pausing on what researchers were actually looking for when they went through these archives. They were not searching for elaborate reports or detailed medical records. Those would have been unusual for the period regardless of the population being examined. What they were looking for was much simpler. A notation that a child had died. A date. A location. A name. Or at least a reference number. The kind of basic administrative marker that tells you a system was aware that an individual existed and then ceased to exist. These are minimal records. They require very little effort to produce. And yet for a significant proportion of the 15,000 children born each year under these circumstances, even those minimal records are missing. Some archivists, when confronted with this pattern, have offered the explanation of administrative negligence. Record-keeping in historical institutional settings was often inconsistent. They point out, staff were overburdened. Systems were not always well-maintained. The failure to record deaths was not unusual in environments where the primary focus was on the living rather than on documenting the dead. This is a reasonable argument, and in many historical contexts it would be entirely sufficient. Administrative negligence is a genuine and well-documented feature of pre-modern institutional life. It explains gaps in records across many different types of historical populations. So when it is applied here, it has the appearance of a logical and defensible response. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the administrative negligence argument runs directly into a problem that is difficult to resolve. The births were being recorded, not sporadically, not partially, but with enough consistency and regularity to produce reliable totals of approximately 15,000 per year, sustained across a significant period of time. That level of documentation does not happen by accident. It requires a functioning administrative system. It requires people who are consistently performing the task of noting arrivals, logging information, and maintaining records over time. The system was not, in other words, generally negligent. It was producing detailed, consistent output at one stage of the process. And then, at the next stage, the stage that would have documented what happened to those children, it appears to have stopped functioning almost entirely. That asymmetry is the core of the problem. It is not simply that records are missing. It is that records are missing in a highly specific and directional way. The documentation gap does not affect the birth records. It affects only what follows them. If administrative negligence were the explanation, one would expect it to be more evenly distributed. A genuinely negligent system tends to produce incomplete records across all stages of its operation, not careful records at one point and near total silence at the next. The pattern here suggests something more selective. And selective gaps in documentation are a different kind of historical problem than general administrative failure. At first, it seems like this could still be explained by differences in institutional priority. Perhaps births were considered important to record for administrative reasons, for census purposes, for resource allocation, for official reporting, while deaths, particularly deaths of infants in this specific category, were considered less significant. In some historical contexts, the deaths of very young children were recorded less carefully than the deaths of older individuals, simply because the administrative systems assigned different levels of importance to different events. This is a documented feature of certain historical record-keeping practices, and if it applied here, it could explain at least part of the gap. But there is a problem with that explanation as well, because in the same regions, during the same periods, the deaths of other children, children born under different circumstances, children belonging to different groups, were being recorded with considerably more consistency. The gap in documentation was not a feature of the period as a whole. It was a feature of this particular population. Other deaths were leaving traces. Other losses were being noted. The administrative systems in these regions were capable of recording childhood mortality when it occurred in other contexts. The question of why that capability was not applied to the children connected to these 15,000 annual births remains unanswered by the existing explanations. Researchers who have compared the documentation patterns side by side have found this distinction to be one of the more compelling aspects of the case. The contrast is not subtle. When they examine records from comparable populations in the same regions and periods, they find the expected pattern. Imperfect records, yes, but records that show some effort to track individuals through their lives and note when those lives ended. When they examine the records connected to these particular births, the pattern changes. The tracking stops. The notation disappears. And the question of what that difference means has not been satisfactorily resolved. Some researchers have suggested that the missing records were not simply never created, but were at some point removed or destroyed. This is a more significant claim, and it is one that requires careful handling. Historical records have been lost, damaged, and destroyed for many reasons over the centuries: fire, flood, war, deliberate culling of archives. The absence of a record does not, by itself, prove that the record once existed and was intentionally removed. That would be a much stronger conclusion than the available evidence supports. But the possibility raises a question that sits uncomfortably alongside the other observations. If the records were created and then lost, why were these particular records more vulnerable to loss than the birth records that preceded them? And if they were never created, why not? And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because every answer to the question of missing documentation seems to generate another question that the answer doesn't fully resolve. Administrative negligence doesn't account for the asymmetry between birth records and death records. Differences in institutional priority don't explain why this population was treated differently from comparable ones. The possibility of record destruction raises questions about why these specific records would have been more likely to disappear. None of these explanations is entirely without merit, but none of them is complete. And the cumulative effect of that incompleteness is the sense that something about the documentation pattern is genuinely unexplained. What the researchers who have examined this most carefully tend to agree on is that the gap is real and that it is significant. It is not an artifact of poor archival methods or an ordinary feature of historical record-keeping in the relevant period. It is a specific, consistent, and directional absence that concentrates around one particular group of children and does not appear with the same character elsewhere in the same historical record. That specificity is what gives the gap its investigative weight. It is not background noise. It is a signal. The question is what the signal means, and that question, despite the attention that has been directed at it, has not yet been answered clearly. The gap between the birth record and the silence that follows is, in the end, not just an archival problem. It is an interpretive problem. It asks researchers to decide what kind of explanation can account for a pattern this specific. A general explanation, one that attributes the missing records to the ordinary limitations of historical documentation, fits some of the evidence, but not all of it. A more specific explanation, one that suggests the gap reflects something particular about how this population was being managed and recorded, raises questions that the available evidence cannot yet fully answer. Both directions of explanation leave something unaccounted for, and it is that unaccounted remainder, that space between the birth entry and the silence that follows, where the first genuine doubt in this investigation takes root. Not a conclusion, not a definitive finding, just a doubt, but a doubt that, once noticed, proves difficult to set aside. To understand what is actually being described here, it is important to start with something that is easy to overlook. These were not remote villages cut off from the rest of the world. These were not isolated communities living entirely outside of organized society. beyond the reach of any institution or system. Many of these births, the ones we have been examining, the ones connected to those 15,000 annual entries, were taking place within structures, within organized arrangements, within systems that had, at least in principle, some form of oversight attached to them. And that single fact changes the nature of this investigation in a way that is difficult to overstate. Because when we talk about high rates of infant mortality in pre-modern settings, there is a version of that story that is relatively straightforward to explain. Children born in isolated rural areas, far from any centralized care, in families with no resources and no access to medical attention, those children faced enormous risks. The absence of support, the absence of oversight, the absence of any formal structure meant that when conditions became dangerous, there was nothing to intervene. High mortality in those environments is tragic, but it is not mysterious. It follows from circumstances that are well understood. Poverty combined with isolation combined with the absence of care produces predictable and devastating outcomes. That version of events does not require further explanation. But that is not the version of events we are looking at here. The children connected to these records were not, in many cases, being born into isolated rural poverty with no surrounding structure. They were being born into systems, institutional systems, organized arrangements where someone, some person, some role, some official function, was designated as responsible for what happened to them. There were facilities involved. There were caregivers, however that term was defined at the time. There were individuals whose job, at least officially, was to provide some level of care for these infants. And that changes everything. Because once a system is present, the questions that apply to it are fundamentally different. This is an important distinction, and it is worth pausing on it. In an unorganized environment, the absence of records can be explained by the absence of a recording structure. There was no one to write things down because there was no system that assigned that responsibility to anyone. But in an organized environment, one with designated caregivers, one with facilities, one with some form of administrative function, records are not supposed to be absent. They are supposed to be produced as part of the basic operation of the system. Someone was responsible for these children. That responsibility implies accountability. And accountability, in an institutional setting, is supposed to generate documentation. The question is why that documentation, in so many of these cases, either does not exist or is unusually thin. When researchers began asking that question, they ran into something that proved difficult to resolve. The systems involved were not informal. They were not improvised arrangements held together by goodwill and good intentions with no administrative structure underneath them. These were organized environments. They had hierarchies. They had designated roles. They had, in at least some cases, connections to broader administrative networks that were themselves capable of producing and maintaining records. And yet, when researchers looked for the documentation that should have come out of these systems, the reports, the accountability records, the explanations of outcomes, what they found was either missing, incomplete, or unusually brief in ways that are hard to account for. This is where the question of accountability becomes central. If someone was responsible for these children, what did they report when outcomes were poor? What explanations did they offer to whatever authority was above them in the system? In a functioning institutional environment, bad outcomes are supposed to generate some kind of official response. A high rate of infant deaths within a managed facility is not a minor administrative matter. It is the kind of outcome that, in a properly functioning system, would prompt questions. It would require answers. It would produce a paper trail, not necessarily a detailed one, not necessarily a thorough investigation, but something, some record of the problem being acknowledged, some indication that the people responsible were aware of what was happening and were being asked to explain it. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the explanations that do exist, the ones that have survived, the ones that researchers have been able to locate in the available archives, are often strikingly brief. Not brief in the way that ordinary historical records are brief, shaped by the conventions of a period when detailed documentation was not standard practice. Brief in a different sense. Brief in a way that sometimes seems calibrated to say as little as possible while still saying something. The reports that do exist tend to acknowledge the general conditions without engaging with the specific details. They note that mortality was high without examining why it was high. They record the fact of deaths without recording the circumstances of those deaths in any depth. And that pattern, acknowledgement without explanation, notation without investigation, is itself a kind of signal. At first, it seems reasonable to attribute this to the general limitations of institutional record-keeping in the relevant period. Historical facilities were often understaffed, underfunded, and administratively overburdened. The people responsible for producing records were frequently the same people responsible for providing care, and in environments where the demands of care were constant, documentation was often deprioritized. That is a genuine feature of historical institutional life, and it is not a trivial one. It explains gaps and silences across many different types of records in many different historical settings. Applied to this case, it has the appearance of a sufficient explanation. But there's a problem with that explanation that becomes visible when you look more carefully at what was and was not being documented. Within the same systems, within the same facilities and administrative networks, other records were being produced with reasonable consistency. Births, as we have already noted, were being logged. Administrative communications were being maintained. In some cases, resource allocations and operational reports were being filed with enough regularity to leave a coherent archival trail. The system was not, in other words, uniformly failing to produce documentation. It was producing documentation across several functions. The gap appeared specifically in the area of outcomes, in the records that would have tracked what happened to the children after their initial entry into the system. This asymmetry is difficult to explain using the administrative negligence framework alone. If a system is too overburdened or too poorly managed to document deaths, it is generally too overburdened or too poorly managed to document much of anything with consistency. The selective nature of the documentation failure, present at the point of entry, absent at the point of outcome, suggests something more specific than general institutional dysfunction. It suggests a pattern in which certain information was being recorded and other information was being left unrecorded in a way that does not appear to be entirely accidental. Whether that was the result of deliberate choices or of structural incentives that made certain kinds of documentation feel less necessary is a question that the evidence does not fully resolve. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Because if the people responsible for these children were filing reports that acknowledged high mortality without investigating it, the question of why they were doing so points in several directions, none of which is entirely comfortable. One possibility is that the conditions were understood to be normal, that within the context of these particular systems, at this particular time, the rates of mortality were seen as an expected feature of the environment rather than as a problem requiring explanation. That would account for the brevity of the reports. If an outcome is expected, there is less institutional pressure to explain it. But that explanation itself raises a question. On what basis were such conditions considered normal? What was the reasoning that made catastrophic infant mortality acceptable within a managed, institutional setting, when the same mortality rates would presumably have prompted some form of response in other contexts? Another possibility is that the people responsible were aware that detailed documentation of the outcomes would raise questions they did not want to answer. This is a more significant suggestion, and it should be handled carefully. It implies a degree of awareness and intentionality that may or may not be supported by the evidence. But it is a possibility that researchers have not been able to entirely rule out. When the explanations offered in existing reports are examined closely, some of them seem to work harder at providing a plausible general account than at engaging honestly with the specific details of what was happening. The language used in some of these records, where records exist at all, tends toward the general and the passive in ways that can feel evasive rather than simply brief. Some researchers who have examined these systems in detail have pointed to a structural feature that may be relevant. The people responsible for these children were often not the same people who were responsible for producing the official reports that reached higher administrative levels. There was, in many cases, a layer of intermediary reporting between the ground-level caregivers and the officials who would have been in a position to ask harder questions. And at that intermediary level, the point where individual observations were being translated into official accounts, there appears to have been significant compression of information. Details that existed at the ground level did not always make it into the formal reports. The reports that reached the people with authority to act on them were, in many cases, already filtered, already shaped, already reduced to the version of events that the people producing them found acceptable to convey. Whether that filtering was deliberate or simply a function of the way institutional reporting worked in these environments is another question that the available evidence does not definitively answer. Both explanations are possible. Both have parallels in other historical contexts. But the effect, regardless of the cause, was the same. The people in positions of official oversight were receiving accounts of the situation that did not fully reflect what was happening on the ground. And if the oversight system was operating on incomplete information, then the accountability it was supposed to provide was incomplete as well. What makes all of this particularly significant is that the outcomes, as we have noted, were catastrophic. The mortality rates associated with these 15,000 annual births were not marginal. They were not slightly elevated above the baseline. They were extreme, concentrated, and, given the institutional context, in need of explanation in a way that isolated rural mortality was not. Yet the explanations that exist are thin. The accountability that should have followed from the institutional context did not appear in the records in the way one would expect it to. And that gap, between the scale of what was happening and the thinness of the official response, is one of the more persistent and unresolved features of this investigation. The background details, when examined carefully, don't fully support the simple version of events. They don't support the narrative in which high mortality was simply an unfortunate and unavoidable feature of difficult times, acknowledged and accepted by the systems responsible for it. The pattern of documentation, what was recorded, what was not recorded, how the existing reports were framed, where the information appears to have been filtered or compressed, points toward something more complicated, not toward a clear conclusion, not toward a definitive explanation of what was happening in these systems and why, but toward a set of questions about accountability that remain genuinely unanswered. And those questions, like the documentation gaps that surround them, are not easy to set aside once they have been noticed. There is a particular moment in any investigation when the evidence stops feeling like a collection of separate problems and starts feeling like something more connected. That moment, in this investigation, came when researchers began doing something that sounds straightforward but is actually quite difficult to do well. They began cross-referencing. They took the birth logs, the facility reports, the regional government documents, and they placed them alongside each other. They looked for points where the records agreed, and they looked for points where the records diverged. And what they found, when they did that work carefully, was not the kind of minor inconsistency that archival research routinely produces. What they found were patterns, specific, recurring, and difficult to explain using the frameworks that had been applied to this investigation up to that point. Cross-referencing historical records is not a simple process. Different sources use different formats, different terminology, different systems of organization. A birth logged in one type of document may be referenced differently in another. A death recorded in a facility report may appear under a different category in a regional government summary. Aligning these sources requires careful, methodical work, and the conclusions that come out of that process are only as reliable as the alignment itself. Researchers working on this material were aware of those limitations. They approached the cross-referencing with appropriate caution, which is why the inconsistencies that emerged from that process carry a particular weight. These were not findings produced by careless interpretation. They were findings that appeared despite the researchers' efforts to account for the ordinary sources of variation in historical documentation. And once they appeared, they proved difficult to dismiss. One of the first and more notable findings involved timing. When researchers mapped the mortality data against the calendar, when they looked at which periods showed elevated death rates and which periods showed lower ones, they found something that did not fit the expected pattern. The mortality rate was not constant. That, in itself, is not surprising. Mortality rates in historical populations almost always fluctuate over time. Seasonal variations, disease cycles, changes in local conditions, all of these produce the kind of movement in mortality data that researchers expect to see. The question is not whether the rate moved. The question is whether the movement can be explained by the conditions that are supposed to drive it. And this is where it becomes unclear. Because when researchers looked at the periods when the mortality rate spiked, when they identified the specific windows of time during which deaths among these children increased significantly, they found that those spikes did not reliably correspond to the conditions that should have caused them. Disease outbreaks are one of the primary drivers of elevated infant mortality in historical populations. When a communicable disease moves through a community or facility, the death rate rises. That is a predictable and well-documented relationship. But in several of the periods where mortality among these children increased sharply, there is no corresponding record of a significant disease outbreak. The regional documentation for those periods does not show elevated illness in the surrounding population. The facility reports, where they exist, do not reference unusual sickness. The spike in deaths appears in the data, but the cause that should accompany it does not appear alongside it. The same problem applies to other potential explanations. Malnutrition is another major driver of infant mortality in historical institutional settings. When resources were scarce, when the supply of food, warmth, or basic necessities declined, the vulnerability of infants increased and mortality tended to rise. That relationship is also well documented, and researchers examining this material were aware of it. They looked for evidence of resource shortages during the periods when mortality spiked. In some cases, they found it. In other cases, they did not. There were periods of elevated mortality that coincided with documented hardship, and those cases fit the standard framework reasonably well. But there were also periods of elevated mortality during times that, by other available measures, appeared relatively stable. Not prosperous, not without difficulty, but not marked by the kind of acute scarcity that would normally produce a significant increase in infant deaths. This raises a question that is difficult to set aside. If the primary drivers of mortality, disease, malnutrition, acute resource shortage, do not consistently explain the timing of the spikes, then what does explain them? The honest answer is that the existing evidence does not provide a clear one. Some researchers have suggested that the conditions within the facilities themselves may have been worse than the regional documentation reflects, that internal shortages or outbreaks occurred that were not captured in the surviving records. That is possible. It is consistent with what we know about the general incompleteness of historical institutional documentation. But it is also a form of explanation that relies on the absence of evidence rather than the presence of it. It fills the gap with an assumption rather than with data. And assumptions, however reasonable, are not the same as findings. The timing inconsistencies are significant on their own, but they become more significant when they are placed alongside a second category of findings that emerged from the cross-referencing process. This second category involves geography rather than time. When researchers began comparing the mortality figures across different facilities in different regions, they found a level of variation that proved difficult to explain using universal causes. Some locations recorded dramatically higher losses than others, not slightly higher, not the kind of moderate variation that would be expected from differences in local conditions. In some cases, the difference between one facility's reported mortality and another's was extreme. Neonatal losses in one location, significantly lower numbers in another, even when the external conditions in those two locations appeared, by available measures, to be broadly comparable. At first, it seems like a simple statistical variation. Populations are not uniform. Facilities are not identical. Differences in outcomes between locations are normal and expected, and historical researchers routinely encounter them. The explanation that most naturally comes to mind is that local conditions varied in ways that the broad documentation does not fully capture. Perhaps one facility had slightly better access to resources. Perhaps one region experienced a milder winter, or a less severe disease season, or slightly more attentive care from the individuals responsible for the children there. These are all plausible local variables, and in many historical investigations they would be sufficient to account for the kind of variation being observed here. But there is a problem with that interpretation, and it is the same kind of problem that appeared with the timing inconsistencies. The variation between facilities was not random in the way that variation driven by local conditions tends to be. If local conditions were the primary explanation, the distribution of outcomes across facilities would be expected to follow a roughly normal pattern. Most facilities clustered around a central mortality rate, with some above and some below, and extreme outliers on either end representing genuinely unusual circumstances. What researchers found instead was something different. The distribution was not centered in the way that pattern would predict. There were clusters of extremely high mortality in certain locations that were not easily connected to identifiable local conditions, and there were locations that reported significantly lower mortality without a clear explanation of what was different about them. This is where the investigation begins to ask harder questions. Because if the variation between facilities does not follow the pattern that would be expected from differences in local conditions, then what is driving it? The standard explanations, disease, malnutrition, resource availability, are universal in their operation. They affect all children in a given environment relatively similarly. A disease outbreak in a facility does not selectively spare some children while taking others in a pattern that would produce extreme facility-level variation. Malnutrition driven by resource shortage affects all children in a facility, not some disproportionate subset. If these universal causes were the primary drivers, the variation between facilities should be more evenly distributed. The fact that it is not raises the possibility that something more specific was operating at the facility level, something that varied from one location to another in ways that the surviving documentation does not explain. Some researchers have looked at the possibility that the variation reflects differences in how facilities reported their numbers rather than differences in actual outcomes. This is a legitimate consideration. Historical institutional reporting was inconsistent, and the numbers recorded in official documents did not always accurately reflect the realities on the ground. Some facilities may have underreported deaths. Others may have recorded deaths that occurred outside their direct care. The numbers themselves, in other words, may not be reliable enough to support the kind of facility-level comparison that researchers have been attempting. This is a genuine limitation of the evidence, and it is one that careful researchers acknowledge. But this explanation also runs into a difficulty, because while it is certainly true that some level of reporting inconsistency would be expected, the variation observed here is large enough that reporting differences alone seem unlikely to account for all of it. If one facility records near total losses while another records significantly fewer deaths, the gap between those figures would have to be explained almost entirely by reporting inconsistency in order for the actual outcomes to be comparable. That degree of inconsistency is not impossible, but it is substantial, and it raises its own questions. If reporting was inconsistent enough to produce differences of that magnitude, then the birth records, which appear in the same administrative systems, should also be affected by that inconsistency. But the birth records, as we have already noted, show a level of consistency that suggests the administrative systems were functioning with reasonable reliability at that stage of the process. The selective unreliability argument encounters the same asymmetry problem that appeared in the earlier examination of documentation gaps. What makes the combination of these two findings, the timing inconsistencies and the geographic variation, particularly significant is what they suggest when considered together. Taken individually, each of them might be attributed to the limitations of historical documentation or the ordinary variation of historical populations. But taken together, they begin to suggest something more. They suggest that the mortality patterns connected to these 15,000 annual births were not simply the product of universal conditions operating uniformly across all affected children. They suggest that something was varying across time, across locations, across different facilities and administrative contexts, in ways that the standard explanations do not fully account for. What that something was is a question the evidence does not currently answer. Researchers who have engaged most closely with this material tend to be careful about what they conclude from these patterns. The inconsistencies are real. The variation is documented. The difficulty of explaining both using conventional frameworks is genuine. But moving from those observations to a specific alternative explanation requires evidence that, at present, is not fully available. The documentation gaps that have appeared throughout this investigation affect this stage of the analysis as well. The records that might clarify the causes behind the timing spikes, detailed facility logs, internal communications, ground-level observations from the relevant periods, are often the same records that are missing or unusually thin. The absence of those records does not allow researchers to fill in the explanation. It simply expands the space of uncertainty. And that expanding uncertainty is, in its own way, one of the more significant findings of this stage of the investigation. The cross-referencing that was supposed to bring clarity to the picture has instead revealed additional layers of complexity. The inconsistencies it uncovered do not resolve the questions raised by earlier stages of the research. They add to them. They suggest that whatever was happening to these children, whatever combination of conditions, decisions, and circumstances produced the outcomes recorded in the surviving documents, was not operating in the simple, uniform way that the standard explanations would predict. The pattern is more complicated than that, and the complication, rather than pointing toward a clear answer, points toward a set of questions that remain open, not for lack of attention, not for lack of careful research, but because the evidence itself, in its gaps and inconsistencies and unexplained variations, does not yet yield the explanation that the pattern seems to demand. At a certain point in an investigation like this one, the broader patterns stop being sufficient. The documentation gaps, the timing inconsistencies, the unexplained geographic variation, these are important findings, and they raise important questions. but they operate at a distance from the actual experience of the children involved. They are findings about records, about numbers, about administrative systems and their failures. What some investigators began to want, as this research progressed, was something closer to the ground level, something that would tell them not just what the record showed or failed to show, but what the physical reality of these children's lives actually looked like in the places where they were being held. And when they turned their attention to the facilities themselves, the specific places where these infants spent their earliest days and weeks, what they found added a layer to this investigation that proved difficult to process within the existing explanatory framework. The facilities in question were not all the same. They varied in size, in location, in the administrative context that surrounded them. Some were larger institutional settings with more formal organizational structures. Others were smaller, more informal arrangements that operated with less oversight and fewer resources. That variation is important to keep in mind, because it means that any description of conditions across these facilities as a whole involves some degree of generalization. Not every facility was identical. Not every location presented the same picture. But when researchers examined the documented cases, the ones where contemporary observers had recorded specific observations about physical conditions, certain features appeared with enough consistency across different locations to suggest that they were not isolated to a single poorly managed facility. They were recurring. And their recurrence is what gives them investigative significance. What those contemporary observers described, in the cases where descriptions survive, was conditions that went beyond the ordinary limitations of historical institutional care. That framing matters. Historical institutional settings for infants and young children were rarely comfortable by modern standards. Resources were limited. Medical knowledge was limited. The understanding of infant health and the conditions necessary to support it was fundamentally different from what is understood today. Some level of inadequacy in these settings is not just expected, it is essentially guaranteed by the context. Researchers examining historical institutions do not apply modern standards to historical conditions and treat the gap as evidence of wrongdoing. That would be historically irresponsible. The baseline against which these conditions need to be measured is not the present. It is the period itself and what was considered adequate within that period. And this is where the documented descriptions become harder to set aside. Because what some contemporary observers recorded was not simply the ordinary inadequacy of a historical institution operating within the limits of its time. What they described was something that appeared, even by the standards of the period, to fall short of basic care. Inadequate feeding was one of the most commonly noted problems. Not feeding practices that were suboptimal by modern nutritional understanding, but feeding that was insufficient to maintain the basic health of infants in ways that would have been recognizable as a problem at the time. Insufficient warmth was another recurring observation. Conditions within certain facilities that exposed very young infants to temperatures and environments that were understood, even in that period, to be dangerous for newborns. Overcrowding appeared repeatedly in the descriptions, with numbers of children being held in spaces that were clearly inadequate for the population they were supposed to serve. Taken individually, each of these conditions might be attributed to resource limitations, to the general difficulty of managing institutional care in a period without modern infrastructure, or to the specific financial constraints under which many of these facilities operated. And that attribution would not be unreasonable. Historical institutions frequently operated under pressure. The people running them were often doing so with fewer resources than the task required, and the physical conditions that resulted from that resource shortfall were frequently poor. An observer noting inadequate feeding or insufficient warmth in a historical institutional setting might simply be documenting the predictable consequences of underfunding and administrative strain. That interpretation is available, and it is not without merit. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the documented conditions were not just observed and noted, they were observed and noted, and then the same conditions were observed and noted again the following year, and the year after that. The contemporary observers who recorded these descriptions were not, in many cases, recording a static situation that no one was aware of. They were recording a situation that had been documented, that had in some cases generated official reports, and that had nevertheless continued without significant change. And that continuity, the persistence of conditions that were being acknowledged rather than addressed, is what begins to separate this situation from ordinary institutional inadequacy driven by resource limitations. The distinction matters, and it is worth being precise about why. When an institution operates under poor conditions because it lacks the resources to do better, the expected pattern is that the people responsible for that institution will either seek additional resources or acknowledge that the institution cannot adequately fulfill its function. When conditions are genuinely beyond anyone's control, when the limitations are structural and the people responsible are doing what they can within those limitations, there's usually some evidence of that effort. Requests for additional support. Reports that frame the situation as a problem in need of a solution. Some indication that the poor outcomes are being treated as failures to be corrected rather than as acceptable features of the operation. What is harder to explain, within the resource limitation framework, is a situation where conditions are documented, where the consequences of those conditions are visible and recorded, and where nothing changes. At first, it seems possible that this persistence reflects bureaucratic inertia rather than anything more deliberate. Historical institutional systems were often slow to respond to documented problems. The chain of reporting between ground-level conditions and the authorities with the power to make changes was frequently long, inefficient, and prone to failure at multiple points. A report filed at the facility level might take a significant amount of time to reach anyone with the authority to act on it. By the time a response was formulated, conditions might have worsened further. The gap between documentation and action is a well-recognized feature of historical institutional management, and it explains a great deal about why poor conditions in historical settings persisted long after they were first recorded. But there's a problem with applying that explanation, hey? The persistence of conditions in the facilities being examined was not short-term. It was not a matter of a report being filed and a response being slow in coming. In documented cases, the same conditions were present and recorded across multiple years. The duration of that persistence extends beyond what bureaucratic delay alone would reasonably account for. At some point, a problem that has been documented for long enough and that has produced consequences visible enough, outcomes as dramatic as the ones recorded in the mortality figures connected to these facilities, would be expected to generate a response from someone in the administrative hierarchy. Not necessarily an effective response. Not necessarily a response that actually improved conditions, but some response that indicates the problem was being treated as a problem. And in a number of the cases researchers examined, even that minimal response is difficult to find. This is where the explanation starts to weaken in a more fundamental way, because there is a meaningful difference between neglect that results from ignorance and neglect that continues after the conditions and their consequences have been acknowledged. The first kind of neglect, the kind that results from not knowing what adequate care looks like or not understanding the relationship between specific conditions and specific outcomes, is a failure. But it is a failure that fits within the ordinary understanding of historical institutional inadequacy. People did not know better. The standards of care were lower. The knowledge base was different. These are real historical facts, and they account for a great deal of suffering in institutional settings across many different periods. The second kind of neglect is different. When conditions are documented, when their consequences are visible, and when they continue anyway, not because resources are unavailable, but because no serious effort is made to change them, the situation begins to suggest something about how the outcomes themselves were being understood by the people responsible. It raises the uncomfortable possibility that on some level, the deaths were not being treated as failures, that they were not generating the kind of institutional response that a failure is supposed to generate, that they were, in some functional sense, being accepted, not necessarily welcomed, not necessarily intended in any direct way, but accepted as an outcome that did not require the kind of urgent response that other kinds of institutional failure would demand. Some researchers who have examined this material have been careful to avoid stating that conclusion too directly. The evidence for it is not conclusive. It is circumstantial. It rests on the absence of a response rather than on the presence of a document that explicitly states that deaths were being accepted. And absence of evidence, as has already been noted in this investigation, is not the same as evidence of a specific intention. It is possible that the lack of response reflects administrative failure at multiple levels, compounded over time, in ways that produced a result that looks like acceptance without actually being it. That interpretation is available. It cannot be ruled out. And yet the available interpretation grows harder to sustain the more carefully the documented cases are examined, because in at least some of the recorded instances, the people responsible for these facilities were not simply failing to respond to a problem they were unaware of. They were producing reports. They were recording observations. They were, in some cases, communicating with administrative authorities above them in the hierarchy. The information was moving through the system, and the system, having received that information, appears in many cases to have done very little with it. That is not a simple administrative failure. It is something that begins to ask harder questions about the nature of the system itself, about what the system was designed to do, what it considered a successful outcome, and whether the deaths of these particular children were understood, within the logic of the system, as a problem at all. This is the layer that the examination of the facilities adds to everything that came before it. The documentation gaps raised questions about what was being recorded and what was being left unrecorded. The timing inconsistencies raised questions about whether the standard causes explained the observed patterns. The geographic variation raised questions about what was different between locations that produced such dramatically different outcomes. And now the conditions within the facilities themselves raise a different kind of question, not just about what happened, but about how the people responsible understood what was happening, whether they saw the outcomes as a failure to be corrected or as a feature of the situation to be managed. And that question, once it has been asked clearly, changes the nature of what this investigation is actually examining. It is no longer just a question about records and mortality rates and administrative gaps. It is beginning to ask something about the intentions and attitudes of the people who were, at least officially, responsible for these children's lives. There is a particular quality to evidence that repeats. A single instance of something unusual can be dismissed. It can be attributed to chance, to circumstance, to the kind of random variation that appears in any large dataset if you look at it long enough. A single anomaly does not demand a structural explanation. It can be absorbed into the existing framework without requiring that framework to change. But when an anomaly repeats, when it appears not once but consistently, across different years, different locations, different administrative contexts, it stops being an anomaly. It becomes a pattern. And patterns require a different kind of explanation than individual events do. They require an account of why the same thing keeps happening. And in this investigation, that account has not yet been provided. This is one of the more striking features of what researchers encountered when they stepped back from individual cases and looked at the full span of the available data. What they found was not a crisis. A crisis has a beginning and an end. It has a period of acute severity followed, eventually, by some kind of resolution or change. What researchers found here was something different. They found repetition, the same high mortality, appearing year after year. The same incomplete records, present not as a one-time archival failure but as a consistent feature of how this population was being documented across an extended period. The same absence of clear explanation, repeated in report after report, in region after region, across a time frame that in some cases extended not just for years but for decades. That kind of repetition is not a crisis. It is something closer to a condition. And conditions, unlike crises, suggest that something structural is operating. To understand why the repetition matters so much, it helps to think about how historical problems typically behave over time. Most large-scale negative outcomes in historical populations are not stable. They fluctuate. Disease-driven mortality rises during outbreaks and falls when the outbreak passes. Famine-related deaths concentrate in specific years of shortage and decline when harvests improve. Mortality driven by conflict peaks during periods of violence and decreases when those periods end. Even structural problems, poverty, institutional inadequacy, systemic neglect, tend to produce mortality patterns that shift in response to changes in conditions, in resources, in the people responsible for management. The historical record is full of examples of bad situations that were bad for a period and then changed, for better or for worse, in ways that are visible in the data. Stability in mortality rates, particularly at high levels, is actually less common than variation. It tends to suggest that whatever is driving the deaths is not responding to the ordinary changes in circumstance that cause other mortality patterns to fluctuate. When researchers examined the mortality rates connected to these 15,000 annual births across multiple years and multiple regions, what they found was a level of stability that is difficult to reconcile with the standard explanations. The rate did not fluctuate dramatically. It did not spike during documented disease years and fall during healthier ones. It did not rise during periods of documented hardship and decline when conditions improved. It held, with a consistency that researchers found notable, at roughly the same level year after year. Not identical from one year to the next, no historical mortality rate is perfectly constant, but stable enough that the variation was within a range that did not suggest significant responsiveness to changing conditions. The rate, in other words, appeared to be tracking something other than the environmental and epidemiological factors that normally drive infant mortality up and down. This is where the two broad camps of interpretation begin to diverge in ways that matter for understanding what the data actually means. Some researchers looking at this stability have argued that it is itself a form of evidence, that the consistency of the rate across years and regions points toward a structural cause rather than a series of unfortunate and unrelated events. Their argument runs roughly as follows. If random factors like disease outbreaks, harvest failures, seasonal temperature variations, or local administrative changes were the primary drivers of mortality, you would expect the rate to vary more than it does. Random factors produce variable outcomes. The relative stability of the rate over an extended period suggests that something more consistent was operating, something that produced roughly the same outcome year after year regardless of the variation in surface conditions. What that something was is a question this camp of researchers is approached with varying degrees of specificity, but their core observation, that stability in the rate is itself informative, is difficult to simply dismiss. Others disagree, and their disagreement is not without foundation. The counter-argument is that high infant mortality was, in the relevant period and context, simply the norm. Infant mortality rates in historical populations were generally high. They were high in good years and bad years, in well-managed institutions and poorly managed ones, across a wide range of social and economic conditions. In that context, a consistently high mortality rate among a specific population of infants is not necessarily evidence of anything unusual. It may simply reflect the baseline reality of infant survival in a period when medical knowledge was limited, resources were scarce, and the conditions necessary for infant health were poorly understood. From this perspective, the stability of the rate is not surprising. It is what you would expect from a population operating under the general conditions of the period, and reading structural significance into that stability may be overinterpreting what is, at its core, an ordinary historical pattern. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the counter-argument, reasonable as it is in general terms, runs into a problem when it is applied specifically to this case. The mortality rates connected to these births were not simply high in the way that historical infant mortality was generally high. They were high in a way that, when compared to other populations in the same regions and periods, appears elevated beyond the baseline. Researchers who have done comparative analysis, who have placed the mortality figures for this specific population alongside mortality figures for other infant populations in comparable settings, have generally found that the rates are not simply consistent with the general historical baseline. They are above it. In some cases, substantially above it. And if the rates are elevated relative to the general baseline of the period, the argument that they simply reflect normal historical conditions becomes harder to sustain. At first, the response to that finding seems straightforward. The specific population being examined was different from the general population in ways that would be expected to produce higher mortality. The circumstances of these births, the social context surrounding them, the conditions within the facilities where the infants were placed, all of these factors set this population apart from the broader infant population of the period. Higher mortality in a population facing additional disadvantages is not surprising. It is, in fact, exactly what would be expected. And if the elevated rate can be fully accounted for by the additional disadvantages facing this specific population, then the stability of that elevated rate is also explicable. It is simply the consistent effect of consistent additional disadvantage. But there's a problem with that interpretation as well, because the additional disadvantages facing this population, the poor facility conditions, the inadequate resources, the institutional neglect that has already been documented in earlier stages of this investigation, were not fixed and immovable. They were conditions that, in principle, were subject to change. Resources could be reallocated. Facilities could be improved. The people responsible for these children could be replaced or retrained or directed to change their practices. If the elevated mortality rate was driven by specific, identifiable, and in principle addressable conditions, the question of why those conditions were never meaningfully addressed returns with additional force. And it connects directly to the broader question that this chapter raises, not just why the pattern repeated, but why no one appears to have intervened to stop it from repeating. This is the question that sits at the center of the repetition problem, and it is, in some ways, the hardest question in this investigation. because the absence of intervention is not simply an absence of action. It implies a presence, the presence of people who were aware of the pattern, who had some form of responsibility for addressing it, and who did not. It implies that at some level within the administrative hierarchy, the decision, whether conscious or simply operational, was made to allow the pattern to continue. And trying to understand that decision, or that non-decision, is where the investigation begins to encounter the limits of what the available evidence can tell us. Some researchers have focused on the question of who, during the relevant period, was actually asking about the pattern. Not in the abstract, not in the way that later researchers would ask about it with the benefit of hindsight and comparative data, but at the time, within the systems responsible for these children. Were there individuals within those systems who noticed the consistency of the mortality rate and raised questions about it? Were there reports filed, communications sent, concerns expressed that have since been lost in the same archival gaps that have complicated so much of this investigation? Or was the pattern genuinely unnoticed, allowed to continue not because anyone decided it should continue, but because the administrative structures in place were not designed to identify and respond to it? The honest answer is that the existing evidence does not allow researchers to answer that question with confidence. In some documented cases, there is evidence that contemporaries were aware of the broad conditions and their consequences. The reports that do exist, however brief, suggest that some level of awareness was present at various points in the administrative hierarchy. But awareness and response are different things. The presence of awareness does not establish that anyone understood the full pattern, the consistency of the rate across years and regions, in the way that later researchers would come to understand it. Awareness of a problem in a single facility in a single year is not the same as awareness of a structural pattern operating across an entire system over decades. The scale of the pattern may simply have been invisible to those operating within it. And yet that explanation, the invisibility of the pattern to those inside the system, only goes so far. At some level of the administrative hierarchy, people had access to enough information to see beyond a single facility and a single year. Regional administrators, officials responsible for oversight across multiple locations, people whose role was specifically to monitor and evaluate the performance of these systems, these individuals would have had access, in principle, to the kind of cross-regional and multi-year data that would have made the pattern visible. Whether they actually compiled and examined that data, and what they made of it if they did, is a question the surviving records do not clearly answer. What the repetition establishes, above all else, is that this was not a problem that resolved itself. Whatever was causing the mortality rate to remain elevated year after year did not weaken over time. It did not respond to the ordinary changes in conditions that cause other historical problems to fluctuate and eventually diminish. It persisted, and in its persistence, it accumulated a weight of significance that individual years of data could not carry on their own. A single year of high mortality is a data point. A decade of high mortality at a consistent level is something that demands an explanation. And when that explanation is not available in the surviving records, when the documentation that should have captured the awareness of and response to the pattern is as absent as the documentation of the individual deaths themselves, the repetition begins to feel like more than a historical accident. It begins to feel like a feature, not a random one, not an incidental one, but a feature of something, a system, a set of priorities, a way of understanding these particular children and what their lives were worth, that has not yet been fully identified or explained. The data, taken across the full span of years and regions that researchers have examined, does not tell a story of a problem that was noticed and addressed. It tells a story of a problem that continued, year after year, in location after location, with the same essential character, the same basic outcomes, and the same remarkable absence of meaningful response. And that story, the story of a pattern that repeated without resolution, is one that the available explanations have not yet succeeded in telling completely. The repetition demands an account, and that account, despite everything that has been examined in this investigation so far, remains incomplete. There is a moment in certain investigations when the frame of the problem has to be expanded, not because the original frame was wrong, but because the evidence keeps appearing outside of it. You begin with a specific location, a specific set of records, a specific cluster of questions about what happened in one place during one period, and then you find the same pattern somewhere else, and then somewhere else again, and at a certain point, The accumulation of similar findings across different locations stops being a series of parallel coincidences and starts demanding a different kind of explanation, one that operates at a level broader than any single facility, any single region, any single administrative system. That is the moment this investigation reached when researchers began expanding their examination beyond the individual cases they had initially been working with. And what they found, when they looked at the wider picture, changed the scale of the problem in ways that proved difficult to absorb within the frameworks that had been applied up to that point. The initial impression, when researchers first began encountering the mortality patterns and documentation gaps that this investigation has been examining, was that they were dealing with a localized problem, a particular facility with poor management, a particular region with inadequate oversight, a particular administrative system that had failed in specific and identifiable ways. That localized framing is the natural starting point for this kind of research. You begin with what is in front of you. You examine the specific cases. You develop an understanding of the particular conditions that seem to be driving the patterns you are observing. And if the problem stayed localized, if the patterns appeared in one place and not in others, the explanation would remain correspondingly local. Poor management in one facility, administrative failure in one region, a specific breakdown in one particular system. Those explanations are uncomfortable, but they are containable. They do not require anything more than a local account. But the problem did not stay localized. As researchers extended their examination, as they moved from one set of regional archives to another, from one administrative system to the ones operating in different areas under different authorities, they began finding the same patterns in different places. Not identical in every detail. Historical variation across regions and administrative contexts produces differences in how patterns manifest, and those differences were present here as well. But the core features, the elevated mortality rate, the gaps in documentation, the absence of clear accountability, the thin official explanations, appeared with enough consistency across different locations to make the localized framing increasingly difficult to maintain. The pattern was not a local phenomenon. It was something wider. And that width is what changes the nature of the mystery and the way this chapter is concerned with. To understand why geographic breadth matters so much analytically, it helps to think about what geographic breadth does to the available explanations. The standard explanations for the patterns observed in this investigation, disease, malnutrition, administrative negligence, resource limitation, are all, in their basic form, local explanations. They describe conditions that operate within a specific environment and produce specific outcomes within that environment. A disease outbreak affects the population exposed to it. Malnutrition follows from resource availability in a particular place. Administrative negligence is a feature of particular administrators managing particular institutions. These explanations have local causes and local effects. They can, in principle, produce similar patterns in different locations if similar local conditions are present in each location. But they do not, by themselves, produce identical patterns across large geographic areas with different climates, different disease environments, different administrative traditions, and different resource availability. This is where the geographic expansion of the evidence begins to create problems for the standard framework. If the patterns observed across these different regions were simply the result of local conditions operating independently in each location, you would expect those patterns to vary in ways that reflect the differences between locations. Disease-driven mortality should be higher in regions with more disease pressure and lower in regions with less. Malnutrition-related deaths should track the local resource availability in each region. Administrative negligence should produce outcomes that reflect the specific character of the administration in each location. Worse in some places, less severe in others, with a distribution that reflects the genuine variation in administrative quality across different systems. What researchers found instead was a consistency across regions that does not fit that expectation. The same approximate mortality rate, the same character of documentation gaps, the same absence of accountability, across locations that, by other measures, were genuinely different from each other. Some historians examining this material have used the word replication to describe what they found, not in the sense that each location was an exact copy of every other. The variation that exists between locations is real and should not be minimized, but in the sense that the core pattern replicated across contexts in a way that suggests the contexts were not the primary driver. When a pattern replicates across genuinely different environments, The explanation for that pattern needs to be found at a level that transcends the individual environments. It needs to be something that was operating across all of them, something that was present in each location not because of local conditions, but because of something shared. And identifying what that shared element was is where the investigation encounters one of its most significant and least resolved questions. At first, it seems like the shared element might be identified through the administrative connections between the different regions. Many historical administrative systems were not fully independent of each other. They operated within broader frameworks, national systems, ecclesiastical networks, political arrangements that linked individual local institutions to wider structures. If all of the regions showing the same pattern were connected through a common administrative framework, that connection might explain the replication. A policy or practice operating at the level of the broader framework could produce similar outcomes in all of the locations connected to it, regardless of the local variation in conditions. That would account for the geographic breadth of the pattern without requiring an explanation that operates outside of institutional structures. But this is where it becomes unclear. Because while some of the affected regions did share administrative connections, others did not. The pattern appeared in locations that were not linked through common institutional frameworks, in some cases, in locations operating under entirely different administrative traditions, in different countries, under different legal and organizational systems. The shared administrative framework explanation can account for some of the geographic replication. It cannot account for all of it. And the portion of the replication that falls outside of shared administrative connections is the portion that most resists easy explanation. If locations with no institutional connection to each other are producing the same patterns, the explanation for those patterns has to be found somewhere other than in the institutional connections between them. Disease offers another potential explanation for geographic replication, and it is one worth examining carefully. Certain diseases spread across wide geographic areas, affecting populations in many different locations with roughly similar severity. If a widespread disease was operating on the specific population of children connected to these births, if something about their situation made them particularly vulnerable to a disease that was operating at a regional or continental level, that could potentially account for some of the consistency in mortality rates across different locations. The disease would be the shared element, operating across all of the affected areas regardless of the differences in local administrative conditions. But there's a problem with the disease explanation as well. For a disease to produce the level of geographic consistency observed here, it would need to be operating with unusual specificity, affecting this particular population of children at elevated rates while leaving other infant populations in the same regions relatively less affected. That kind of specificity is not impossible for certain diseases, but it would require biological or social conditions that created particular vulnerability in this population and not in others. And the evidence for those conditions is not clearly present in the surviving records. More significantly, a geographically widespread disease affecting a specific population would be expected to appear in the documentation of that period, in medical records, in public health correspondence, in the accounts of observers who noticed that a particular group of children was being disproportionately affected. That documentation, if it exists, has not been clearly identified, and this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Because the most straightforward account of a consistent pattern appearing across different regions, different administrative systems, and in some cases different countries is that something was operating at a level above the individual locations. Something systemic. Something embedded not in the local conditions of any particular place but in the way this specific population, these children connected to these particular births, was being managed, understood, and treated across the entire scope of the environments where they appeared. Some historians examining this material have argued for exactly that conclusion. They have suggested that the consistency across regions points to a shared systemic cause, a feature of how these children were categorized, how the institutions responsible for them were structured, or how the outcomes associated with them were understood, that operated independently of local variation and produced similar results across all of the affected areas. What that systemic cause might concretely have been is where the research runs into its most significant unresolved question. The suggestion that something systemic was operating is, in itself, a reasonable inference from the geographic pattern. The pattern is there. Its breadth is documented. Its consistency across different environments is a finding that has been replicated by multiple researchers working independently in different archives. The inference from that consistency to a shared systemic cause is not a leap. It is a logical conclusion from the available evidence. But the next step, identifying specifically what the systemic cause was, how it operated, who was responsible for it, and whether it involved deliberate decisions or structural features that produced outcomes without anyone explicitly choosing them, is a step the available evidence does not clearly support. The wider the problem turns out to be, the harder it becomes to explain with simple answers. That is not a paradox. It is a feature of how historical complexity operates. Local problems have local explanations. Systemic problems require systemic explanations. And systemic explanations, in turn, require evidence that operates at the systemic level, evidence of shared policies, shared practices, shared understandings that connected the different locations and produced the consistent patterns. That evidence, in this investigation, is either absent or too fragmentary to support a definitive account. The archival gaps that have complicated the investigation at every earlier stage appear here as well, at the level where they would be most significant. The documents that might show how a systemic cause operated, the policy correspondence, the interinstitutional communications, the high-level administrative records that would have connected the different regional patterns into a single coherent picture, are frequently the documents that are hardest to find. Researchers who have grappled with this have expressed a particular kind of frustration. Not the frustration of encountering a problem that cannot be solved, but the frustration of encountering a problem whose scale is visible while its mechanisms remain obscure. The width of the pattern is clear. The consistency of the core features across different regions and different systems is documented. The inadequacy of local explanations for a pattern of this geographic breadth is apparent. What is not apparent is the specific account that connects the width of the pattern to a cause capable of producing it. And the gap between what is visible and what can be explained is, at this stage of the investigation, wider than it has been at any earlier point. That widening gap is itself a significant finding. It means that this investigation is not dealing with a problem that becomes simpler as more evidence is examined. It is dealing with a problem that becomes more complex. Each expansion of the geographic scope of the research reveals more instances of the pattern and fewer satisfactory explanations for it. Each additional region that shows the same features adds to the weight of evidence that something significant was happening while simultaneously making the existing explanations less adequate. And the cumulative effect of that process, of an investigation that keeps finding more of the same thing without finding the explanation that the evidence demands, is a picture of something that was genuinely large in scale, genuinely consistent in character, and genuinely resistant to the kind of clear, contained account that would make it possible to say with confidence what it was and why it happened. There comes a point in any investigation where the available evidence forces a choice. Not a choice about what happened. That question may remain open for a long time, but a choice about how to interpret what the evidence is showing. The patterns have been documented. The geographic breadth has been established. The inadequacy of simple local explanations has been demonstrated across multiple regions and multiple administrative contexts. And now the question shifts from what the evidence shows to what the evidence means. That shift is where interpretation enters. And where interpretation enters, disagreement follows. Because different researchers, working from the same body of evidence, have arrived at genuinely different conclusions about what these patterns represent and what produced them. None of those conclusions has been able to account for everything the evidence contains. All of them have been challenged, and the debate between them continues without a clear resolution, which is itself a significant fact about the state of the investigation at this point. The first thing worth understanding about the interpretive debate is that it did not emerge from nothing. It emerged from a specific and identifiable problem. The official explanation does not adequately account for what the evidence shows. When an investigation produces findings that the standard account cannot explain, alternative interpretations naturally develop. Researchers look at the same patterns and ask whether there is a different framework that fits the evidence better. That is a normal part of historical inquiry. It is not a sign of conspiracy thinking or excessive speculation. It is what happens when careful researchers encounter material that does not fit the available explanations. And in this case, the material that does not fit is substantial enough, and documented clearly enough, that the emergence of alternative interpretations is not surprising. The surprising thing would be if no alternative interpretations had developed at all. One of the most significant alternative interpretations that has emerged focuses on the question of deliberate neglect. This is perhaps the most serious of the interpretations being considered, and it deserves careful examination. The argument, as those who hold it have developed it, is not simply that these children died in large numbers. It is that they were placed in conditions where survival was unlikely, and that the people managing those conditions were, on some level, aware of what those conditions produced. The distinction matters. It is the difference between a system that failed despite trying to succeed and a system that operated in a way that made failure predictable, and continued operating that way regardless. Those who argue for the deliberate neglect interpretation point to several features of the evidence that they believe support this reading. The consistency of the outcomes across different locations and different periods is one. If outcomes this severe were genuinely the result of uncontrollable circumstances, they argue, you would expect more variation. The documented awareness among those working within these systems is another. There are records, partial, fragmentary, but present, indicating that people managing these children understood that mortality rates were high and continued operating without making significant changes. And the absence of reform, in the face of documented awareness, is something this interpretation treats as significant. But this is where it becomes unclear, because deliberate neglect is a serious claim, and the evidence for it is not as clean as those who hold the interpretation sometimes suggest. The most significant problem is the question of intent. For deliberate neglect to be the correct account, there needs to be some evidence that the outcomes were not simply accepted but were, in some sense, chosen, that the people managing these systems understood what they were producing and continued producing it because that was the outcome they wanted, or at least the outcome they were willing to tolerate. And while there is evidence of awareness, there is a gap between awareness and intent that the surviving records do not clearly bridge. Awareness that a system is producing bad outcomes is not the same as choosing to produce those outcomes. People can be aware that conditions are bad, can be documented as expressing concern about those conditions, and still be operating in a system that does not respond adequately to that concern, without that failure being a matter of deliberate choice. The deliberate neglect interpretation requires more than documented awareness. It requires evidence of a decision to maintain conditions that were known to be deadly, and that evidence, in the form that would be conclusive, has not been clearly identified. A different interpretation takes a different approach to the mystery. Rather than focusing on the conditions the children experienced, it focuses on the mortality data itself, and raises the possibility that the data may not mean what it appears to mean. Some researchers working in this area have argued that not all of the recorded deaths were actual deaths. Their argument is that some of the children who appear in the records as having died may have been moved, transferred, adopted, or otherwise removed from the systems tracking them, and that these removals were recorded as deaths because death was the easiest administrative category to apply, or because recording a death was, for some reason, more convenient than accurately recording what actually happened. This raises questions that are difficult to dismiss. If even a portion of the recorded deaths were actually undocumented transfers or disappearances, that would change the nature of the mystery significantly. It would mean that the mortality rate, already an extraordinary figure, overstates the actual death toll while concealing something else, a population of children whose fate is genuinely unknown because the records obscuring that fate were deliberately constructed to prevent inquiry. At first, this interpretation seems to offer a kind of relief. If the children did not all die, perhaps the picture is less bleak than the standard reading suggests. But the more carefully this interpretation is examined, the more questions it generates. If some children were being moved or transferred and recorded as dead, who was making those decisions? Where were these children being moved to? What happened to them after they disappeared from the official records? The documentation problem this interpretation introduces is in some ways more troubling than the mortality problem it partially resolves. A system that deliberately misrecords deaths as deaths, that uses the administrative category of mortality to conceal the actual fate of children, is a system engaging in something more calculated than simple negligence. And the evidence for this interpretation, like the evidence for the deliberate neglect interpretation, is suggestive rather than conclusive. There are anomalies in the records that some researchers read as evidence of misrecording. Others read the same anomalies as evidence of administrative inconsistency, a less troubling explanation that does not require the same degree of intentionality. And then there is a third interpretation, which takes a more skeptical view of the entire investigative enterprise. Some researchers have argued that the search for hidden explanations, whether deliberate neglect, data manipulation, or systemic causes, reflects a modern tendency to project complexity onto historical situations that were, in fact, much simpler. Their argument is that extreme poverty and the absence of adequate medical knowledge are entirely sufficient to explain the mortality rates observed in these records. Children in conditions of severe material deprivation, without access to medical care, without adequate nutrition, and in environments where infectious disease was common and treatment was limited, died at extraordinarily high rates. That is a historical fact about many populations during many periods. The argument, in its basic form, is that this population fits within a broader historical pattern of high infant mortality under conditions of poverty and medical limitation, and that reading deeper patterns into the numbers, or inferring systemic causes from geographic consistency, is a retrospective imposition of modern analytical frameworks onto historical reality. But this is where the skeptical interpretation runs into its own difficulties. The researchers who find poverty and medical limitation insufficient as explanations do not deny that those conditions were present. They deny that those conditions are sufficient to explain the specific features of the evidence, particularly the consistency across regions with different poverty profiles, the character of the documentation gaps, and the absence of accountability that persists across different administrative systems. A disease kills indiscriminately within the populations it reaches. Poverty produces high mortality across the populations it affects. But neither disease nor poverty, operating independently in different locations, produces the same character of documentation gap in each location. And it is the documentation gaps, the specific way in which the records fail, the particular categories of information that are consistently absent, that some researchers find most difficult to account for through the straightforward poverty explanation. It doesn't fully make sense that similar documentation failures would appear independently across different administrative systems unless something connected those failures. This is the challenge that sits at the center of the interpretive debate. Each interpretation has a version of the evidence it explains well and a version it handles less convincingly. The deliberate neglect interpretation accounts for the consistency of outcomes and the documented awareness within the systems. It does not convincingly explain the absence of clear evidence of intent. The data manipulation interpretation accounts for certain anomalies in the records and raises important questions about the actual fate of some of these children. It does not clearly explain who was making these decisions or what the purpose of the manipulation would have been. The poverty and medical limitation interpretation fits within a broader historical pattern of child mortality and avoids requiring the presence of deliberate agency. It does not adequately explain the geographic consistency of the documentation gaps or the absence of the kind of variation that purely local conditions should have produced. None of these interpretations is without serious problems, and the fact that all three remain active in the scholarly debate, that none of them has been able to displace the others through superior explanatory power, is a reflection of how genuinely unresolved the underlying questions are. Some disputes in historical research are eventually settled by the discovery of new evidence or the development of a new analytical framework that reorders the existing evidence. This dispute has not been settled. It has persisted across decades of research, across multiple generations of scholars working in different archival traditions, and it shows no clear signs of approaching resolution. What the persistence of the debate tells us, perhaps more clearly than any of the specific interpretations, is something about the nature of the evidence itself. This is evidence that resists a single clean account. It is evidence that different researchers, applying different frameworks and different standards of inference, can read in genuinely different ways. That is not a feature of bad research or inadequate methodology. It is a feature of historical material that is fragmentary in specific ways, that has gaps in specific locations, and that reveals enough to make the standard explanations inadequate without revealing enough to make any alternative explanation conclusive. This kind of evidence that is both revealing and incomplete, that shows something significant while obscuring the mechanisms behind it, is among the most difficult material that historical investigation encounters. It produces genuine uncertainty rather than clear answers, and genuine uncertainty is uncomfortable precisely because it resists resolution. The researchers who have continued working with this material despite its resistance to clear answers have, in some ways, performed the most honest kind of historical inquiry. They have documented what the evidence shows. They have developed interpretations that attempt to account for it. They have challenged each other's interpretations and identified the weaknesses in each alternative. And they have, in most cases, arrived at a position that acknowledges the incompleteness of the available account without pretending to a certainty that the evidence does not support. That position, the acknowledgement that something significant happened, that the scale of it was larger than simple local explanations can account for, and that the specific mechanisms remain genuinely unclear, is an uncomfortable place to rest. It offers no resolution. It does not assign clear responsibility. It does not provide the kind of definitive account that makes it possible to say with confidence what this was. But it is the position that the evidence, honestly examined, actually supports. And perhaps the most significant fact about the interpretive debate at this stage is not which interpretation is correct, but what the debate itself reveals. It reveals that the question of what happened to these children, why they died in the numbers they did, whether those numbers accurately reflect actual mortality, and whether the systems responsible for them were operating in ways that any reasonable account of institutional responsibility can justify, remains genuinely open. The evidence is there. The patterns are visible. The consistency across regions is documented. And the explanation for all of it remains, in the most important respects, unresolved. Which means the investigation is not finished. The questions that remain are not small ones. There are investigations that end with answers. The evidence accumulates, the pattern becomes clear, the explanation emerges, and the question that drove the inquiry finds a resolution that, however uncomfortable, at least provides a resting point. This is not one of those investigations. What this examination has produced, across the chapters that preceded this one, is not a clean resolution. It is something more complicated and, in certain ways, more unsettling. It is a picture of something that genuinely happened, documented in real records, across real locations, over a real period of time, whose explanation remains incomplete in ways that the available evidence cannot fully resolve. And arriving at the end of an investigation in that condition raises its own questions, not just about what happened, but about why an investigation of this scale and this character has not produced clearer answers. That question, the question about the investigation itself, about why this particular mystery has remained at the edges of serious historical inquiry, is one of the things this chapter is concerned with. The starting point, before anything else, is the numbers. Because whatever interpretive disagreements exist about what the numbers mean, the numbers themselves are not in serious dispute. 15,000 births annually, a mortality rate approaching 90%, documented across multiple independent sources, across multiple regions, across multiple years. Those figures, taken together, describe something of extraordinary scale. They describe a situation in which the children connected to these births were dying at a rate that, by any reasonable standard of comparison, sits well outside the range of what normal historical child mortality, even under conditions of poverty and medical limitation, would predict. That is not a contested claim. It is a mathematical observation about what the records show, and it is the appropriate starting point for everything that follows, because it establishes that whatever happened here was not a minor or marginal phenomenon. It was something that touched tens of thousands of children over a significant period of time. The scale of it demands explanation. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the explanation that the standard historical account offers, disease, poverty, the absence of adequate medical knowledge, does not fit what the numbers actually show in the way that a satisfactory explanation should fit its evidence. This is not a new observation. It has been made by multiple researchers working independently in different archival traditions. The standard account is not wrong about the conditions that existed. Those conditions were real. Poverty was real. Disease was real. Medical limitation was real. But those conditions, operating in the way that historical evidence shows them operating on other comparable populations, do not produce mortality rates of this consistency and this magnitude across genuinely different environments. And the gap between what the standard account predicts and what the evidence actually shows is wide enough that accepting the standard account requires setting aside a significant body of evidence that it cannot explain. The documentation gaps are part of that body of evidence. They have appeared at every stage of this investigation, and they appear again here at the end, because they have not been satisfactorily explained. Gaps in historical records are normal. Archives are incomplete. Documents are lost, damaged, or never created in the first place. That is a baseline condition of historical research, and no serious researcher treats the absence of a document as automatically meaningful. But the gaps in this investigation have a specific character that distinguishes them from ordinary archival incompleteness. They appear in particular categories of record. They are consistent across different archival systems that would not be expected to fail in the same ways. and they cluster around precisely the information that would be most relevant to understanding what happened to these children, the information about conditions, about decisions, about accountability. Ordinary archival gaps are distributed somewhat randomly across the historical record. These gaps are not random. They are concentrated. And concentrated gaps raise questions that randomly distributed gaps do not. It doesn't fully make sense that the same categories of information would be consistently absent across different administrative systems operating in different regions under different authorities. The simplest explanation for randomly distributed gaps is ordinary loss over time. The simplest explanation for concentrated gaps is something else. What that something else might be is a question the evidence raises without clearly answering. Some researchers have argued that the gaps reflect deliberate removal or suppression of records, that someone, at some point, had reason to ensure that certain information did not survive into the historical record. Others have argued that the gaps reflect a systematic failure of documentation at a particular level of the administrative systems involved, that the information was never recorded in the forms that would have preserved it, rather than being recorded and subsequently removed. Both explanations are possible. Neither has been conclusively established, and the inability to determine which explanation fits better is itself a feature of the evidential situation that deserves attention. The consistency of the mortality rate across different environments is the other major feature of the evidence that the standard account cannot adequately explain. This point was developed in earlier chapters, but it bears retaining to here, at the end of the investigation, because it is perhaps the single most analytically significant finding. When a pattern appears in one location, local conditions can explain it. When the same pattern appears across many locations with genuinely different local conditions, different disease environments, different poverty profiles, different administrative traditions, the explanation for that pattern has to be found somewhere other than in the local conditions of each individual place. The consistency, in other words, points toward something shared, something that was operating across all of the affected locations regardless of their differences. And identifying what that shared element was is precisely the question that the investigation has been unable to answer with the clarity that the evidence demands. Some researchers believe the answer lies in the way these children were categorized and understood by the systems responsible for them. The argument is that there was something about how this specific population was classified, how they were identified, how they were treated within the administrative systems that managed them, that produced similar outcomes regardless of the local conditions in which those systems operated. This is a systemic explanation. It does not require deliberate intent. It requires only that the systems involved shared certain features in how they approach this population, and that those shared features produce consistent results. This raises questions about what those shared features might have been, how they developed, and whether the people operating within these systems understood what they were producing. Those questions remain open. The systemic explanation is a reasonable inference from the evidence. The specific content of the system it points toward is not clearly established. And then there is the question that sits behind all of the others, the question of why this mystery has received so little sustained historical attention. For something of this scale, involving this many children over this length of time, the level of serious historical investigation has been, by most measures, remarkably limited. This is not a minor observation. It is a significant fact about the reception of this material within the broader field of historical inquiry. Major historical events and patterns of this scale typically generate substantial scholarly attention. They are examined, debated, re-examined, and incorporated into the broader historical record in ways that, over time, produce a reasonably developed body of knowledge even when definitive answers remain elusive. That has not happened here. The investigation has remained at the edges of mainstream historical inquiry, pursued by a relatively small number of researchers working in specialized archives, without generating the level of broader scholarly engagement that the scale of the phenomenon would seem to warrant. Why that is, what accounts for the relative absence of sustained attention, is itself a question worth sitting with. One possible explanation is simply that the material is difficult. The archival challenges are real. The evidence is fragmentary. The interpretive questions are genuinely hard. Research that is difficult and does not produce clean answers is, in the practical landscape of academic inquiry, less likely to attract sustained investment than research that offers clearer paths to resolution. That is a structural feature of how scholarly attention is allocated, and it is not a sinister explanation, but it does not fully account for the pattern. Difficult material in other domains has generated substantial scholarly attention precisely because of its difficulty, because the questions it raises are considered important enough to justify the investment. Which brings the question back to its starting point. Why have the questions raised by this material not been considered important enough to justify that investment? At first, it seems like the answer might lie in how the population involved has been understood historically. Children connected to these particular circumstances occupied a specific social position in the historical periods under examination, a position that, in many contexts, placed them outside the categories of persons whose fates were considered matters of significant public concern. The historical record reflects that position. These children appear in certain kinds of administrative documents and disappear from others in ways that track the social significance assigned to them by the systems of their time. If their fates were not considered significant enough to document thoroughly, it may not be surprising that their fates have not been considered significant enough to investigate thoroughly. But that explanation, while it has some descriptive accuracy, is also troubling in a specific way. It suggests that the limited investigation of this material is not an accident of archival difficulty. It is a continuation, in a different form, of the same pattern of limited attention that characterizes the historical treatment of these children in the records themselves. This is where the explanation becomes difficult, because if the limited investigation reflects a continuation of historical patterns of attention, if the children who were not considered significant enough to document thoroughly are also not being considered significant enough to investigate thoroughly, then the investigation of the mystery and the mystery itself are connected in a way that goes beyond simple archival difficulty. The question of why so little is known becomes linked to the question of why so little was recorded. And both of those questions point toward the same underlying feature of how this population was understood and treated across a long period of time. That feature, whatever its specific content, is something the investigation keeps approaching without being able to clearly identify or name. The facts, as they stand at this point, occupy a particular kind of evidential space. They are established enough to be taken seriously. They are incomplete enough to resist clear interpretation. The mortality rate is real. The geographic consistency is real. The documentation gaps are real. The inadequacy of the standard explanations is real. All of that is documented, replicated across independent research, and not seriously contested by those who have examined the material carefully. What is not real, or rather, what has not been established, is the explanation that connects all of these features into a coherent account. The account that would name the mechanism, identify the decision-makers, describe the structure that produced consistent outcomes across different locations, and explain why the documentation looks the way it does. That account has not emerged from the available evidence, and the gap between what is known and what would be needed to produce that account is not a small one. There is something particular about reaching the end of an investigation in this condition, not with an answer, but with a clearer picture of the question. The investigation has not failed. It has produced findings. It has established the scale of the phenomenon. It has identified the inadequacies of the existing explanations. It has mapped the geographic breadth of the pattern and documented the character of the evidence gaps. It has raised interpretive questions that deserve more sustained attention than they have received. And perhaps most importantly, it has established that this is a mystery that remains genuinely open, not because the evidence is too thin to support inquiry, but because the inquiry has not yet been conducted at the scale that the evidence demands. The facts are recorded. The pattern is visible. The children connected to these births existed, and the records of their fates are real, however incomplete those records are. And the explanation for what those records show remains, at this point, incomplete. Where the investigation goes from here, whether the questions it has raised will eventually attract the sustained attention they require, is something that cannot be determined from within the investigation itself. It is a question that sits outside the evidence, in the space where decisions about what matters enough to pursue are made. And that space, too, is part of the mystery.